Faith Keller's doctor delivered the devastating news with clinical detachment on a sweltering Arizona afternoon in 1876. "I'm sorry, Miss Keller, but the infection has caused irreparable damage. You'll never be able to bear children." Those words echoed through the small examination room in Bisbee like a death knell, stealing her breath and shattering dreams she'd harbored since childhood. Faith staggered out of the doctor's office, the wooden steps of the porch creaking beneath her boots as the world tilted around her. 24 years old, and her future had just collapsed. Women in Bisbee had two paths: marriage and motherhood or spinsterhood. With no prospect of children, who would want her now? The copper mining town of Bisbee, nestled in the Mule Mountains of Arizona Territory, continued its bustling afternoon activities, oblivious to her heartbreak. Wagons rattled down the dusty Main Street, miners trudged toward the Copper Queen mine for the evening shift, and women hurried to complete errands before sunset. Faith moved through it all like a ghost, barely registering the familiar faces that nodded greetings. "Faith. Faith Keller, are you all right?" Mrs. Abernathy called from her general store porch. "You're white as a sheet, girl." Faith managed a weak smile. "Just feeling a bit poorly today, Mrs. Abernathy. Nothing to worry about." The older woman frowned but didn't press. Faith continued walking, not ready to share her burden. Not when the weight of it threatened to crush her completely. 3 days later, Faith stood at her small classroom desk, watching her students file out for the day. Teaching the children of Bisbee had been her salvation after losing her parents to influenza 5 years earlier. Now, it felt like salt in a fresh wound. These children would never be hers, not truly. She would never have a child of her own. "Miss Keller." A deep voice from the doorway startled her. Faith looked up to see Rylan Stone leaning against the doorframe, his broad shoulders nearly filling the space. His dark hat was clasped respectfully in calloused hands, revealing sun-streaked brown hair that needed trimming. At 32, Ryland had established himself as one of the most successful ranchers in the territory, his cattle operation sprawling across acres of land outside town. "Mr. Stone, what brings you to my classroom?" She straightened, smoothing her simple blue dress. "I've got a proposition for you," Ryland said, stepping into the room. His boots echoed on the wooden floor. "My sister's boy, James, he needs schooling, but he's a handful since Caroline passed. Won't sit still for the lessons at the main schoolhouse." Faith nodded, remembering the quiet 8-year-old boy who'd come to live with his uncle after his mother's death last winter. "You want me to tutor him privately? 3 evenings a week if you're willing. I'll pay double the going rate." His gray eyes held her steadily. "The boy needs special attention, and word is you're the best teacher in the territory." Faith felt a small spark of purpose ignite. "I'd be happy to help James. He can come to my place tomorrow evening to start." Ryland nodded, a relieved smile softening his weathered face. "Much obliged, Miss Keller. I'll bring him by myself at 6. As he turned to leave, Faith found herself studying his retreating form. Rylan Stone was respected in Bisbee not just for his success, but for taking in his orphan nephew without hesitation. He'd never shown interest in marriage, though many a widow and unmarried woman had set their caps for him over the years. Faith sighed, gathering her books. It didn't matter. Even if Ryland Stone was the last man on earth, what good was a woman who couldn't give him children? The next evening, Faith prepared her small home for her new pupil. She lived in a modest 2-room cabin on the outskirts of town, a legacy from her parents, along with enough money to maintain her independence. The front room served as both kitchen and living area, while a small bedroom occupied the back. She'd cleared the kitchen table for lessons and baked ginger cookies as a welcome gesture. Precisely at 6, A knock sounded at her door. Faith opened it to find Ryland standing there, one hand resting on his nephew's thin shoulder. James looked up at her with solemn eyes, his resemblance to his uncle striking despite his youth. "Evening, Miss Keller," Ryland said. "This here's James." "Hello, James." Faith smiled warmly. "I'm very pleased to meet you properly. I've made cookies if your uncle approves." James glanced up at Ryland, who nodded. "Go on in, son." As James entered, Faith noticed the worn book clutched in his small hands. "You brought your own reading material." "It was my mama's," the boy said softly, the first words he'd spoken. "Uncle Ryland says I need to learn to read it proper." Ryland cleared his throat. "I'll be back in 2 hours. You mind what Miss Keller says, James." When Ryland departed, Faith directed James to the table. "May I see your book?" James handed it over reluctantly. It was a volume of poetry, well-loved and clearly treasured. "My mama read from it every night." "That's a wonderful way to remember her," Faith said gently. "Would you like to learn to read it yourself?" James nodded, his eyes serious beyond his years. For the next 2 hours, Faith worked with the boy, assessing his knowledge and beginning simple reading exercises. She discovered he was bright but distracted, clearly struggling with his loss. By the time Ryland returned, they'd made modest progress and James had relaxed enough to eat 3 cookies. "How'd he do?" Ryland asked as they stood on her small porch. James waited by his uncle's horse, stroking its nose. "He's very intelligent but grieving," Faith replied softly. "Give him time." "I think these lessons will help." Ryland studied her face in the fading light. "You've had your own troubles lately." Faith stiffened. "Pardon, small town," he explained with a shrug. "Doc Jensen's wife mentioned you'd had some bad news." Heat rushed to Faith's face. "That's highly improper of her to discuss my medical matters." She didn't share details, just said you'd been dealt a hard blow. His expression softened. "Figured that's why you agreed to these lessons so quick. Sometimes helping others is the best medicine." Faith looked away. "I should think my reasons are my own, Mr. Stone." "Fair enough." He settled his hat on his head. "Thursday evening, then?" She nodded, watching as he lifted James onto the horse and mounted behind him. As they rode away, Faith felt an unexpected lightness. For 2 hours, she'd focused entirely on James's needs, forgetting her own sorrow. Over the next 3 weeks, James became the highlight of Faith's existence. Their sessions expanded to reading, arithmetic, and history. The boy's natural curiosity began to emerge from beneath his grief, and occasionally, Faith even coaxed a smile from him. Rylan always arrived punctually to collect his nephew, sometimes lingering to discuss James's progress. Faith found herself looking forward to these brief conversations, despite her determination to maintain professional distance. On a particularly sweltering evening in late June, Faith and James worked on the porch to catch the occasional breeze. As James laboriously copied letters, Faith caught sight of a group of women approaching her home. "Afternoon, Miss Keller," called Harriet Wilson, the banker's wife and self-appointed social arbiter of Bisbee. 3 other women from the town's upper echelon accompanied her. Faith rose, surprised. "Good afternoon, ladies. What brings you this way?" "We're collecting for the church picnic next Sunday," Harriet explained, her eyes darting curiously to James, "and discussing the preparations for the 4th of July celebrations." "I'll certainly contribute," Faith said, moving toward the steps. "We heard you've been giving private lessons to the Stone boy," said Edith Mills, gesturing toward James. "Yes, 3 evenings a week," Faith confirmed, uncomfortable with their scrutiny. Harriet lowered her voice, though not enough to prevent James from hearing. "You ought to be careful, Faith." A single woman entertaining a man in her home regularly, even if it's for the child people talk. Faith felt heat rise to her face. Mr. Stone merely drops off and collects his nephew. There's nothing improper. Of course not, Harriet said with false sweetness. But you know how quickly reputations can be damaged, and it's not as if it could lead to anything proper. Everyone knows Rylan Stone wants more children, being so good with his nephew. Such a shame you can't. That's quite enough, Faith interrupted sharply, mortified. She glanced at James, who had stopped writing and was watching with wide eyes. I'll send my contribution to the church tomorrow. After the women departed, Faith turned to find James studying her. Are you all right, Miss Keller? Faith forced a smile. Of course. Let's continue with your lesson. But the damage had been done. That evening when Rylan arrived, James blurted out, Uncle Rylan, is it true Miss Keller can't have babies? Faith froze, mortification burning through her. Ryland's eyes widened briefly before his expression settled into controlled calm. James, that's not something we discuss, he said firmly. Apologize to Miss Keller. I'm sorry, James mumbled, confused by the adult's reactions. Go wait by the horse, Ryland directed. When the boy was out of earshot, he turned to Faith. I apologize for that. Faith couldn't meet his eyes. The ladies from town visited today. They were indiscreet, gossiping harpies, Ryland muttered. Faith, it's getting late, she interrupted. James did well with his multiplication tables today. Ryland studied her for a long moment. This doesn't change our arrangement. Of course not, Faith said stiffly. James's education isn't affected by my personal circumstances. Ryland opened his mouth as if to say more, then thought better of it. With a nod, he departed, leaving Faith to close her door and finally release the tears she'd been holding back. The next morning, Faith woke to the sound of horses outside her home. Puzzled, she wrapped a shawl around her nightdress and peered through the window. Ryland sat astride his horse, leading another with a small figure huddled in the saddle. Quickly dressing, Faith opened her door. Mr. Stone. Is everything all right? Ryland dismounted, his face grim. James had nightmares all night, kept saying he'd made you sad and was worried you wouldn't teach him any more. The small boy looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. I'm sorry, Miss Keller. Faith's heart constricted. Oh, James. Come inside, both of you. Over coffee and leftover bread, Faith gently explained to James that sometimes adults kept private matters to themselves, not because they were secrets, but because they were personal. Like how I don't want to talk about when Mama died, James asked perceptively. Exactly like that, Faith agreed, meeting Ryland's gaze over the boy's head. After James settled with a book, Ryland drew Faith aside. I need to say something, and I'd appreciate you hearing me out. Faith nodded apprehensively. What those women did was cruel, Ryland said, his voice low and controlled. But I want you to know something. I've seen you with James these past weeks. The way you teach him, encourage him, comfort him. He paused, choosing his words carefully. There's more than one way to be a mother, Faith Keller. Unexpected tears filled her eyes. That's kind of you to say. It's the truth, Rylan insisted. And I won't have those vultures making you feel less than what you are. Before Faith could respond, James called out a question about his book, breaking the moment. The morning passed quickly, with Faith eventually giving an impromptu lesson while Rylan observed quietly from her small sitting area. When they finally prepared to leave, Rylan hesitated at the door. Sunday's the church picnic. Would you consider attending with us? Might silence some of the talk if we arrive together. Faith hesitated, understanding the gesture for what it was, a public declaration that he respected her. I'd be honored, Mr. Stone. Rylan, he corrected with a small smile. About time you used my given name, don't you think? The church picnic transformed Faith's relationship with both Rylan and the town of Bisbee. Walking beside Rylan, with James happily darting ahead, Faith endured the surprised looks and whispered comments with newfound confidence. Ryland's presence beside her, respectful but attentive, silenced the most vicious gossips. As summer progressed into fall, James's tutoring sessions continued, but Ryland began joining them more frequently. Sometimes he brought dinner, simple fare prepared by his housekeeper, and the three would eat together before the lesson. Other times, he'd bring small gifts, wildflowers he'd spotted on the ride-in, a carved wooden horse for James, or once, a delicate silver hairpin for Faith that had belonged to his mother. In late September, disaster struck the Copper Queen mine. A tunnel collapse trapped 12 miners, throwing the town into chaos. Faith dismissed her regular classes early as frantic relatives gathered at the mine entrance. She joined the women organizing food and coffee for the rescue workers, her heart heavy with the knowledge that several of her students' fathers were among the trapped. 20 hours into the rescue effort, Faith was distributing coffee when she spotted Rylan among the men digging. His shirt was torn and filthy, his face streaked with dirt, but he worked tirelessly alongside the miners. When he saw her, he straightened, accepting the cup she offered. "You should rest," she said softly, noting the exhaustion in his eyes. "Can't," he replied grimly. "Bennett's down there, James's friend, Tommy's father. Promised the boy I'd help get him out." Faith nodded, understanding. "Where is James?" "With Mrs. Perkins at the ranch." Ryland drained the coffee. "He's worried sick." Faith made a quick decision. "Let me go to him. He shouldn't be alone." Ryland's relief was palpable. "You do that, of course." Faith squeezed his arm gently. "You focus on the rescue. I'll take care of James." Faith rode to the Stone Ranch on a horse borrowed from the livery stable, arriving to find James wide-eyed and frightened despite Mrs. Perkins's best efforts to distract him. The elderly housekeeper greeted Faith with visible relief. "He won't eat, won't sleep," Mrs. Perkins explained. "Just sits by the window watching for his uncle." Faith spent the night at the ranch, eventually coaxing James to sleep by reading from his mother's poetry book. The next morning, they received word that the rescue had succeeded. All 12 miners were alive, though some were badly injured. When Ryland finally returned home, exhausted beyond words, he found Faith and James asleep on the sofa, the boy curled against her side with tear tracks dried on his cheeks. The sight stopped him in the doorway, an unexpected tightness gripping his chest. Mrs. Perkins appeared beside him. "She's a godsend, that one," the old woman whispered. "Boy wouldn't settle for anyone else." Ryland nodded, unable to articulate the emotions roiling through him. Faith stirred then, her eyes opening to find him watching. For a moment, neither spoke, a current of understanding passing between them that transcended words. In the weeks that followed, Ryland found increasingly frequent reasons to visit Faith outside of James's lessons. He brought her to the ranch for Sunday dinners, invited her to ride with them to check the autumn calves, and once, daringly, escorted her to a dance in town. On a crisp November afternoon, Faith accompanied Rylan and James to select a site for the ranch's Christmas tree. As James ran ahead examining various pines, Ryland took Faith's gloved hand in his. "I need to ask you something," he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Faith's heart quickened. "Yes, James turns 9 next month." Ryland's gray eyes held her steadily. "I'm thinking of adopting him legally, making him my son in name as well as in heart." "That's wonderful," Faith said sincerely. "He needs that security." "Thing is," Ryland continued, "a boy needs more than just an uncle. He needs a proper family." He took a deep breath. "Faith, these past months watching you with James, you've become essential to us both." Faith's breath caught. "Ryland, I know what you're thinking," he said quickly. That I'm a man who wants children and you can't give me any. His hand tightened on hers. But that's where you're wrong. You've already given us something precious. You've shown James that love doesn't end with loss. You've taught him joy again. Tears filled Faith's eyes as Ryland dropped to one knee in the frost-covered ground. Faith Keller, I love you. James loves you. Will you marry me, be James's mother in truth and my partner in all things? But children, Faith began, her voice trembling. They said you'd never be a mother, Ryland said softly. I say then we'll find children who need one. He smiled up at her. Starting with a certain boy who's already halfway to considering you his. Faith looked past Ryland to where James watched them with hopeful eyes. In that moment, she understood what Ryland was offering, not just marriage, but a family created from love rather than blood. Yes, she whispered. Then louder. Yes, James whooped, running toward them as Ryland stood and pulled Faith into his arms. For the first time since the doctor's devastating pronouncement, Faith felt whole again, no longer defined by what she couldn't do, but by the love she could give. They married on Christmas Eve in Bisbee's small church, with James proudly serving as best man. The same townspeople who had whispered behind Faith's back now brought wedding gifts and warm wishes. Even Harriet Wilson admitted the match made perfect sense, though she couldn't resist adding that it was fortunate Mr. Stone already had his heir. Faith and Ryland weathered such comments with united dignity, focusing instead on building their life together. The first months of 1877 brought adjustments as Faith moved to the ranch, learning to balance her continued teaching with her new roles as wife and mother. James flourished under their combined care, his nightmares gradually fading as security replaced uncertainty. In April, their peaceful existence faced its first significant challenge. Ryland returned from Bisbee with troubling news. Apaches raided the Sullivan homestead last night, he told Faith gravely after James had gone to bed. Took the livestock, burned the cabin. Tom and Mary Sullivan were killed. Faith gasped. What about their children? They have 4, don't they? That's what I need to discuss with you. Ryland ran a hand through his hair. The oldest boy, Michael, managed to hide his sisters in the root cellar. They survived, but they've got no kin in the territory. Faith's heart raced, understanding where this conversation was heading. How old are they? Michael's 12. The twins, Sarah and Emma, are 6. Little Abigail's just 3. Ryland met her eyes. Sheriff's arranging to send them to an orphanage in Tucson, unless someone here is willing to take them. Faith stood, moving to the window where moonlight illuminated the ranch yard. 4 children, she murmured. That would make 5 altogether with James. Ryland came to stand behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. It's a lot to ask. We've only been married a few months. Faith turned to face him. You promised me children who needed a mother, she said softly. I believe we've found them. Ryland's face broke into a relieved smile. I hoped you'd say that. I've already told the sheriff we'll take them, pending your agreement. The next day, they prepared the ranch for 4 traumatized children. Faith and Mrs. Perkins readied bedrooms while Ryland and James constructed additional beds. By evening, Sheriff Miller arrived with the Sullivan children, a solemn procession of haunted young faces and meager belongings. Michael, lanky and protective, positioned himself between his sisters and the world. The twins clung to each other, identical faces streaked with tears and dirt. Little Abigail, too young to fully comprehend her loss, clutched a ragged doll and stared at Faith with enormous blue eyes. Faith knelt before them. I know we can't replace what you've lost, she said gently, but we want to give you a safe home for as long as you need it. Forever, Ryland added quietly, standing behind Faith with James at his side. We want to give you a home forever if you'll have us. Michael regarded them suspiciously. "Why would you take in 4 more kids?" Faith exchanged a glance with Ryland before answering truthfully. "Because I can't have children of my own, but that doesn't mean I can't be a mother to children who need one." Something in her honesty reached Michael. His rigid posture softened slightly. "The twins wet the bed sometimes, and Abby cries at night." "That's all right," Faith assured him. "We've got plenty of sheets, and I'm quite good at comforting nightmares." James stepped forward. "I had bad dreams too when my mama died. Miss Faith, I mean, my new mother she helps." That simple statement from one orphan to another accomplished what adult reassurances couldn't. Michael gave a small nod, accepting their offer at least temporarily. The first weeks with the Sullivan children tested Faith and Ryland's commitment and resources. Nightmares plagued all 4 children. Michael resisted authority. The twins spoke only to each other in whispers, and Abigail alternated between clinging desperately to Faith and rejecting comfort entirely. Faith suspended her teaching position to focus on the children, implementing a gentle routine that gradually provided structure to their chaotic emotions. Rylan expanded the ranch house, adding 2 new bedrooms with his own hands. James, initially uncertain about sharing his new parents, discovered the pride of being an older brother to the younger children. By summer, small victories accumulated. Michael helped Ryland with the cattle, channeling his anger into productive work. The twins began speaking to others, enchanted by Mrs. Perkins's cookie-baking lessons. Abigail's vocabulary expanded dramatically, her natural exuberance emerging from beneath her grief. In July, Ryland initiated legal adoption proceedings for all 4 Sullivan children. When he and Faith explained their intentions, Michael asked the question they'd been expecting. "Will we have to change our name to Stone?" Faith and Ryland exchanged glances. "That would be customary," Ryland acknowledged, "but we understand if you want to keep your parents' name." Michael considered this seriously. Pa was proud of being a Sullivan, but he hesitated, looking at his siblings. "I think he'd understand us being Stones now. You're our family too." In August 1877, Ryland and Faith Stone legally adopted Michael, Sarah, Emma, and Abigail, adding their names to the family Bible alongside James's. The ranch, once too quiet with only Ryland rattling around in it, now bustled with activity from dawn until dusk. Faith discovered that motherhood, denied to her by biology, came naturally in practice. She bandaged skinned knees, mediated sibling disputes, and celebrated small accomplishments. Each child connected with her differently: Michael through serious conversations about books, the twins through crafts and music, Abigail through bedtime stories and endless questions. By Christmas, the transformation was remarkable. 5 children hung stockings on the fireplace mantel, their nightmares now rare enough to be noteworthy. Faith resumed teaching part-time, bringing the youngest children with her to school and arranging lessons around ranch responsibilities. The people of Bisbee, who had once whispered about Faith's barrenness, now marveled at the Stone family. "Those children are flourishing," Reverend Thompson remarked after church one Sunday. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing together those who need each other." Faith squeezed Ryland's hand, watching their brood racing across the churchyard. "It's not what I imagined," she admitted. "It's better." As the new year of 1878 dawned, tragedy struck again, this time bringing an unexpected blessing. A fierce winter storm trapped a wagon train in the mountains near Bisbee. When the survivors finally struggled into town, they brought word that several families had perished, including a young couple with an infant daughter. The baby, miraculously alive thanks to her mother's final act of wrapping her in every available blanket, was brought to the doctor's home. Jensen's wife, remembering Faith's situation, immediately sent word to the Stone Ranch. Faith arrived in Bisbee to find a 2-month-old girl, underweight but alert, with a tuft of red hair and determined eyes. Her parents were headed to California, Dr. Jensen explained. No identification, no relatives we can locate. She'll be sent to an orphanage when she's strong enough to travel. Faith cradled the tiny infant, feeling her grip a finger with surprising strength. Does she have a name? The woman who found her said there was a letter pinned to her blanket. Parents called her Hope. Faith looked up as Ryland entered the room, having followed more slowly with the children. Hope, she repeated softly. Ryland stood beside her, gazing down at the infant. Seems fitting, he murmured. 5 pairs of eyes studied the baby with varying degrees of curiosity. Michael, now 13 and growing tall, peered over Faith's shoulder. She's awfully small. She needs a mother, 6-year-old Emma declared with the confidence of experience. And a father, Sarah added. 4-year-old Abigail's brow furrowed. Does that mean she's our new sister? Faith looked at Rylan, a question in her eyes. They had discussed the possibility of taking in an infant, but the reality was far more daunting than the theory. Ryland's smile was answer enough. I believe it does, he told Abigail, if your mother agrees. James, who had witnessed the beginning of their family, stepped forward. We've got room for one more Stone, he said solemnly. Hope Stone sounds just right. Thus, Hope became the 6th child to join the Stone family, completing their circle in a way none of them had anticipated. The infant brought new challenges, midnight feedings, colic, the constant vigilance required by a baby, but also new joy. The older children doted on her, taking turns holding her and competing to make her smile. By spring, Hope was thriving, her red hair forming wispy curls around a face that grew chubby with good care. Faith often marveled at how naturally she had taken to mothering an infant, despite having no experience. The skills came with the need. She discovered another gift in a life now full of unexpected blessings. In April 1878, just as the wildflowers began carpeting the hills around the ranch, Ryland suggested a family outing. They packed a picnic lunch and rode to a secluded meadow, the children racing ahead while Faith carried Hope in a sling across her chest. It's been a year, Ryland remarked as they spread blankets beneath a cottonwood tree. A year since the Sullivan children came to us. Faith nodded, watching Michael teaching the twins to skip stones across a small stream. James supervised Abigail's flower collecting, careful to keep her from wandering too far. Sometimes I can hardly remember what life was like before, she admitted, gently rocking Hope as the baby fussed. It feels as though they've always been ours. Ryland's arm circled her shoulders. You've given them something precious, Faith. A mother's love when they thought they'd lost everything. Faith leaned into his embrace. And they've given me what I thought I could never have. She looked up at him, her eyes bright. 6 children, Ryland, 6. Sometimes I still can't believe it. Believe it, he said, kissing her forehead. Though I'm thinking we might need to expand the house again, getting a bit crowded with all these stones underfoot. Faith laughed. Mrs. Perkins already mentioned the same thing. She says her kitchen wasn't designed for feeding an army. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play in the spring sunshine. Faith reflected on the journey that had brought her here from that devastating diagnosis in the doctor's office to this moment of perfect contentment. You know, she said thoughtfully, Dr. Jensen asked me last week if I regretted not being able to have children of my own. She glanced down at Hope, now sleeping peacefully against her chest. I told him I couldn't imagine loving any child more than I love these 6, Biology doesn't create a mother, love does. Ryland's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. You've proven that beyond any doubt. As the afternoon waned, they called the children for lunch. Gathered on the blankets, passing sandwiches and lemonade, they formed a picture of family that defied conventional expectations, but fulfilled the deepest yearnings of each heart present. Michael, once so wary, now looked to Ryland for approval and guidance. The twins had blossomed into distinct personalities, Sarah, artistic and dreamy, Emma, practical and organized. Abigail's traumatic start had faded into memory, replaced by the security of constant love. James had found his voice and confidence as both son and brother. And baby Hope, rescued from tragedy, would never remember a time when she wasn't surrounded by the Stone family's affection. Faith caught Ryland watching her with an expression that still made her heart quicken after nearly 18 months of marriage. "What?" she asked softly. "Just thinking about that day in the doctor's office," he replied. "If he hadn't told you that news, our paths might never have crossed this way." Faith considered this. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the greatest blessings," she said. "I wouldn't change a thing." As twilight approached, they packed up their picnic, gathered the sleepy younger children, and headed home. The Stone Ranch awaited them, no longer just a house, but a sanctuary built from second chances and unconventional love. That night, after the children were settled in bed, Faith and Ryland sat on the porch, watching stars appear in the vast Arizona sky. "I have something for you," Ryland said, reaching into his pocket. He handed her a small wooden box. Faith opened it to find a gold locket on a delicate chain. Inside were 2 miniature photographs, one of Ryland, the other a carefully arranged portrait of all 6 children, taken in Bisbee the previous month. "It's beautiful," Faith whispered, tears threatening. Ryland fastened it around her neck. "So you can keep us all close to your heart, though we're already there." Faith touched the locket gently. "I never thought I'd have this." "A piece of jewelry," Ryland teased. "A family," Faith corrected, leaning against his shoulder. "Children calling me mother." The chance to nurture and guide them. She turned to face him. "Thank you for seeing beyond my limitations to what was possible." Ryland drew her into his arms. "Faith Stone, you have never been limited, only redirected. These children needed exactly what you had to give." Inside the house, a child cried out hope, likely hungry again. Faith rose, purpose in every movement. "Duty calls," she said with a smile. "Always does," Rylan agreed, standing beside her. "Fortunately, we're equal to it." Faith paused at the door, looking back at the man who had transformed her greatest sorrow into immeasurable joy. "More than equal," she said softly. "We were made for this." And as she went to comfort their youngest child, Faith knew it was true. The diagnosis that once seemed like an ending had merely been the beginning of a different path, one filled with more love than she had ever imagined possible. In the years that followed, the Stone family became well known throughout Cochise County. Their ranch prospered, allowing them to provide not only for their 6 children but occasionally for others in need. Faith eventually returned to teaching full-time, establishing a reputation for exceptional compassion toward children facing hardships. Michael Stone graduated from the Territorial University in 1886, returning to partner with his father in expanding the ranch operations. The twins followed different paths, Sarah pursuing art in San Francisco, Emma staying closer to home as Bisbee's first female telegraph operator. James combined his love of books and business, opening a successful general store in town. Abigail displayed a talent for medicine, eventually studying to become one of Arizona's early female physicians. And Hope, their unexpected blessing, grew into a young woman with her mother's compassion and her father's determination. When asked about their remarkable family, Faith always gave the same answer. "They said I'd never be a mother. My husband said we'd find children who needed one. We were both right, and that made all the difference." By 1890, with their children grown or nearly so, Faith and Ryland had taken in 6 more orphaned or abandoned children, raising a total of 12 sons and daughters. Their extended family gathered each Christmas at the ranch, filling the expanded house with laughter, music, and the chaotic joy of multiple generations. Faith often stood at the window during these gatherings, watching Ryland with their grandchildren, biological descendants of their adopted children, but no less precious for the lack of shared blood. In those moments, she remembered the devastated young woman who had stumbled from the doctor's office in 1876, believing her future had ended. How wrong she had been. That diagnosis hadn't limited her capacity to mother, it had expanded it beyond anything she could have imagined, allowing her to create a legacy of love that would continue long after she and Ryland were gone. And in the end, wasn't that what motherhood was truly about? Not the bearing of children, but the raising of them. Not the passing on of physical traits, but the transmission of values and love that would echo through generations. Faith touched the locket she still wore daily, now containing images of all 12 children they had raised. Inside was inscribed a simple phrase that had become their family motto: "Love makes a family." It had been true from the beginning. It would remain true until the end.